Okay, everyone, we might dive into it if that is okay. And if anyone else joins, we can let them in a bit later. Welcome, everyone, to our August Geography Matters. It's a pleasure tonight that we'll be hearing from John Rainbird and Associate Professor Javier Leon, who'll be discussing the risks, impacts, and opportunities of climate change in the Torres Strait. Before we get started, though, just a real quick bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded, and we will be releasing it in a couple of days' time. As such, please do make sure that you keep your microphone muted and your camera off. If you do want to ask any questions, particularly in the second half of the event tonight, please do make sure to throw that into the meeting chat. Before I do get started into a few other details, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting this evening and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Before doing a few quick bios, also just a plug for a number of upcoming events. There is plenty on in the RGSQ calendar as always. So if you haven't already seen, please do check the website or our social media channels for other events coming up. That does include, on the topic of oceans and water, we do have our Geography in Conversation later this month on the 27th of August, talking about the blue economy. And we also do have a map group presentation coming up looking at exploring imaging radar and regrowth detection in Queensland's woodlands. Also to mention is the 2024 photography competition this year, looking at Queensland icons, which will be closing at the end of September. For other details, please check the website and our socials. Brilliant. Well, tonight we are joined, as I said a little bit earlier, by John Rainbird and Javier Leon. John has worked for the Torres Strait Regional Authority in his role as Climate Change and Coastal Manager for 14 years. He's originally from South Africa, where he obtained his Master's of Science in Conservation Biology. He has a long-standing interest in the areas of change, sustainability and resilience. Prior to his current role, he worked in an array of conservation and sustainability-related positions in government and the NGO sector. Today, he's based up in Cairns. As our interviewer for this evening and to help manage our questions, we have Javier Leon, who's a geographer with a broad interest in both geomorphology and particularly interested in the study and management of coastal systems, including sandy beaches and coral reefs. He has developed and collaborated in multidisciplinary research projects combining field data, geospatial techniques and modelling in study sites across the Torres Strait, our topic tonight, the Great Barrier Reef and Pacific Islands. His aim is to answer questions related to the links between morphology, ecology and management in the current changing climate and sea level rise context. Can't think of a better pair to be diving into tonight's topic. With that, John, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. So I just had to unmute myself, find my way around. Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and for this opportunity to talk about a very special part of the world, the Torres Straits. And can everyone see the screen okay? I'm just going to put it onto slideshow mode. Is that better?
Looking good.
All right. So I've got quite a lot of ground I want to cover. So John, please pull me up if I'm, on the time front if you need to. But the Torres Straits, so the picture you're looking at the moment is Saibai Island. It's right up in the northern part of the Straits, and it gives you a sense of they're definitely one of the most exposed communities to the impacts of sea level rise. As you can see, very low lying with a lot of wetland behind them, so they don't have a lot of room to maneuver when you're talking about the age we live in at the moment with the impacts of climate change. Just for a little bit of context, the Torres Straits, as most of you I'm sure know, but surprisingly a lot of people don't, is a group of islands that sits between the tip of Cape York and Papua New Guinea and Indonesia to the north. And it's some of the most northern islands are literally a stone's throw away from Papua New Guinea. When you're on Boigu or Saibai, you see the Papua New Guinea shoreline. and there's quite a lot of active trade between communities and so on up there. So it's a very unique part of Australia's geography, and from a jurisdictional and geopolitical perspective as well. So I just wanted to, I promise you not to kill you with dot points tonight, but I do want to run through some of the really interesting and quite probably unique features of the Torres Straits as a region. It sits between the Arafura Sea and the Coral Sea. It's actually quite a shallow marine environment for the most part. Its average depth is about 20 meters. And despite the fact that it has these really powerful currents that run through sections of it, it actually has very sluggish, limited circulation. It has the most complex tidal systems anywhere in the world. The tides on Boigu are completely out of sync with the tides on Saibai, just a couple of kilometers away. We've got these oceanic driving forces up in the Gulf of Papua, which have a big impact on the marine life and currents in the strait. And then we've got this upwelling that comes up off the continental shelf in the east, which has its whole, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the effects of that further on in the presentation. But generally, it's not a particularly nutrient-rich environment. It's very significant in terms of the reef systems. Some of the most pristine, there's 1,200 reefs in the Torres Straits. It's part of the Great Barrier Reef, but because it's not within the marine park, it tends to be a little bit forgotten in that respect. It has some of the most extensive seagrass meadows anywhere in the world, some of the most intact, diverse mangrove systems anywhere in the world. It is the capital of dugong on the planet, and it's very significant for turtles as well, a few different turtle species. So from a marine ecology perspective in particular, very, very beautiful, very, very special part of the world, very important. And then it also gets picked up by some of the broader influences in the Western Pacific from a perspective of climate and weather. And geomorphologically, it's also quite diverse. So there's really 4 main island types in the region. There's over 300 islands, about 17 of them have communities on them. And we've got islands that are formed from basically sedimentary muds coming out of rivers of Papua New Guinea. We've got typical land-based islands that are part of the mountain chain that runs up through Eastern Australia, volcanic islands in the east, and coral caves. So very diverse in that respect. Generally pretty low impact, particularly in the marine environment, compared to, there's no real agricultural industry in the Torres Straits. Culturally very diverse and unique. Torres Strait Islanders have been living in that region for many thousands of years, and there's a lot of cross-culture between Papua New Guinea and Pacific Islanders. It's the home of native title, as many of you probably know, with Eddie Mabo coming from Mer Island. And more recently with pearling and a range of other things that have happened over the last couple of 100 years, actually very diverse cultural mix of people up in that part of the world. It also has quite a complex governance arrangement with native title bodies, local government, Queensland government, Commonwealth government. So it's quite a challenging space, given it's only got a population of about 12 to 14,000 people. On top of that, it's an international shipping route, and it's Australia's only international border zone with Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. So just from a point of view from some of the climate stuff, there is quite a strong influence in the Western Pacific. The Western Pacific warm pool has quite a big influence on weather systems and other features in the Torres Straits as well. I'm going to just run through a little bit of the information on climate. So we've seen a real clear trend in increase in sea surface temperatures. We work a lot with the Australian Institute of Marine Science on collecting marine data up there. So climate change is very evident in a lot of ways in the Torres Straits. Projections are looking likely that by the end of this century, pretty much every day is going to be over 30 degrees. At the moment, it's about 150 days of the year on average, but we're looking at some quite important shifts in average temperatures up in that part of the world. And that has huge implications for the people as well as the environment as well, as you can well imagine. So I just want to give you a couple of photos of what it's like in parts of these are both up Saibai in the north when we get the big tides. This is calm weather. no stormy activity, but traditionally sea level would come and wash through many parts of the community. And Torres Strait Islanders have been very active in calling for action on climate change for a long time. So the photo on the left of the community on Parma is one of the events they held to try and raise awareness around the fact that they're, of course, in a very vulnerable position for an issue for which they've had very little role in the cause of. So there is some real equity issues for people up in that part of the world. And as you probably know, there are 2 court cases at the moment involving Torres Strait Islanders around the issue of climate change. So when the weather's particularly stormy and nasty, there can be some pretty severe impacts around king tides on communities. The Torres Straits is not just at risk from direct climate impacts in the region, but a lot of climate impacts can be secondary impacts from climate events that happen outside of the region. It's very dependent on the mainland of Australia for a lot of its resources and economy. So this diagram is just one we use as part of our communications tools around climate, but it's looking at the cascading consequences of climate change and where you can kind of intervene in these systems to build adaptation responses. But it's important to be part of the work we're trying to build people's broader understanding around climate change, how it impacts them, and the many different areas of life it's likely and is already impacting. Because when people have a better appreciation of climate change, that also improves their ability to respond effectively to the issue. So when people think about climate change in the Torres Straits, they mostly think about sea level rise. But if we look at a bunch of the climate challenges down the left-hand side, we've got changes in average weather, extreme weather, variability in weather systems, storms, sea level rise, shifts in seasons, warming of the oceans, marine heat waves, ocean acidity, changes in ocean currents. There are more. But these are some of the main drivers of climate impacts from the shifts we see in the weather systems. And then if we look across some of the core domains of life and environment in the Torres Straits, we can see that climate actually is quite a significant threat to many parts of the system up there, socially, ecologically, and economically as well. So it's really important to recognize that sea level rise is just one of the threats to the region. The main areas of vulnerability really are obviously the coastal zone. Fisheries are very exposed, culture is very exposed, and health is very exposed. These are probably the main areas of risk, even though climate does tend to affect pretty much every facet of life in the region. The reefs in the coral in the Torres Straits have not been very well studied. Traditionally, when I started there, we got some funding in about 2013 to start really looking at the reefs. And I was able to find one paper looking at the coral reefs of the Torres Straits at the time. And it was a paper from exactly 100 years previously. So it's really, as a region, falls between the gaps a lot of the time in terms of research efforts. And the reefs are a classic example of that. Excuse me, I managed to pick up a little bit of a cold, so if I suddenly burst out into a coughing, spluttering fit, I'm not dying, but I'll just pause myself and regain. Hopefully it doesn't happen. So this is the surveys we did after a bleaching event in 2016. I think this one was. We've had a few mass bleaching events up there. Before 2010, it wasn't really something that anyone was familiar with as an issue, but we have seen with the increase in temperatures in the oceans, they're becoming more common and then becoming fairly extensive. So the western reefs get hit the hardest. The waters are shallow. The eastern reefs are protected to a large degree by this cool upwelling of water that comes up the continental shelf. And fortunately for that part of the world, it acts like a giant air conditioning system for the reefs, essentially. And those reefs don't tend to bleach very often at all, thankfully. They are quite different reef systems as you move across the straits. The water is a lot more turbid in the west. It's a lot clearer and a bit deeper in the east. And the reefs are really absolutely beautiful and quite spectacular, but fortunately protected by this upwelling. And they were probably going to be some of the most important reefs from a climate resilience point of view because of this natural cooling that they experience from their location next to the continental shelf. So they have quite a high level of inbuilt resilience, and they are part of the 50 reefs campaign around climate resilient reefs around the world. I wanted to also touch on the health impacts, and the region already suffers from a lot of indigenous disadvantage when it comes to health. There are very high levels of diabetes and cardiovascular problems and the typical spectrum of things we tend to see in remote indigenous communities. But people tend to forget that even though the temperature increases we see up there are not as stark as you see in other parts of Australia, because the humidity is already so high, it doesn't take much of a temperature increase before humidity combined with temperature actually starts to have a real risk to human health. So you don't need a big temperature, because obviously we mostly cool off through perspiration, and when the air is saturated with water, our natural body's ability to cool is vastly diminished. So we've been taking temperature readings from some of the houses on Musik Island, and the data is quite alarming as to how the kind of percentage of the year people actually living in what you would consider a heat stress situation. So this house in Musik, 18% of the year was in a heat stress situation. And the challenge with that is when it goes over an extended period, people's bodies don't get a chance to cool off overnight. The nights are warm, and so that heat stress tends to accumulate. It's also a challenge because the way BOM looks at this sort of stuff is they don't factor in humidity, they only look at temperature, and humidity is a really big issue in tropical areas. So fisheries is a really important part of life in the Torres Straits. It's one of the main mainstays of the economy up there. Culturally, it's very significant. The people in the Torres Straits have a very close connection to their sea country, but it is an area that is also highly exposed to the impacts of climate change. The tropical lobsters are a really important source of food and income, and there's quite a lot of work going on around trying to understand the impacts of climate on the marine systems up there. But we've already seen some quite big impacts in the fisheries, because when the water gets really warm, when we have these marine heat waves, when they go out to catch lobsters and they bring them up to these cages where they keep them floating beneath the boats, they often just die if the water is too warm. So in 2016, they lost an enormous amount of crayfish that they'd harvested from a marine heat wave. It also has potential impacts on the recruitment of crayfish, for example, which is driven to a large degree by the Gulf of Papua Jaya, pushing the spawn into the Torres Straits. And if that shifts with climate change, it could massively impact the fisheries. Most marine species are migrating towards cooler waters, and because the Straits is already tropical, that means most of the species there may likely move to cooler water, which would mean they'd move out of the Straits, and there's not necessarily a lot to replace them with that would move from anywhere warmer into the region. So there are a number of areas where fisheries are at risk, and so one of the aspects that people are looking at is also how do you diversify the kinds of ways that people can get sustenance and income from the marine environment beyond the classic fisheries that are there at the moment. So obviously, I think a lot of people here are particularly interested in the coastal dynamics and sea level rise. We've done a fair bit of work. There's still a lot more to do, but there are a range of strategies you can deal with sea level rise. And the one that people up there are most keen on, essentially, as you can well understand, is really just trying to build seawalls to protect their communities from the big tides. This is the seawall that we built along the front of Saibai Island. It's a long wall winding along the coast. It cost about $24 million of investment to build this wall. And it does provide some protection, but it has a limited lifespan in terms of sea level rise and how far that may go, which is still a big unknown. And it does have impacts on amenities. So whilst these kinds of strategies are helpful and they do provide some level of peace of mind, they're not necessarily super long-term strategies. They're very expensive, and they're not necessarily fail-proof as well when you get big events. This is Masik, which is one of the central coral Cay islands. And again, you can see just from the imagery that it's a very flat, low-lying community. About 300 people live on Masik. And the map on the right is the sea level rise mapping we've done, which basically shows you that under the typical sea level rise scenarios we might expect over this coming century, that it's possible that during, and I need to stipulate that this is during highest tide events, that a lot of the island could potentially be underwater. That doesn't mean say the island's underwater most of the time. It means most of the time it's probably not underwater, but you don't need to be underwater all the time to have obviously severe impacts on life, on infrastructure, on the vegetation and everything else when you have frequent flooding events occurring, particularly when it's seawater. So there's been ongoing work. On the right is an image showing that some of the community have decided they just want to get on with and have started doing their own strategies to try and protect the coast. They do see changes in the coast. The left is Parma Island, where there's also been a lot of work done putting in geotextile bags to try and stabilize one of the more dynamic parts of the island. The cays are a particularly challenging part of the region because they are naturally so dynamic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we've got the situation where hard infrastructure and settlement is being developed on a very dynamic coral cay. And of course, the infrastructure is not particularly flexible once it's in. So with the shifts we're seeing, and we have seen some market shifts in the coastline of some of these cays, there really is the strategy that people are looking at the moment is really trying to stabilize those coastal areas so that they don't move in and impact homes and gardens, etc. But again, very expensive exercise and does impact coastal amenity as well. So this is the same island, Parma, where you can see naturally the end of the island fluctuates a lot. So coral cays tend to form at a confluence of about 3 currents where the coral sands accumulate. And they naturally, there's 2 main seasons in the Torres Straits, the wet and the dry, and the winds shift. And so obviously you get this fluctuation at the ends of these caves, like a tail of a dog that wags. But when we've seen changes there that are kind of beyond what people see as the norm. And so there is an investment there to try and protect homes and other cultural sites of significance for the community. But again, there's quite a big amount of investment that has gone into this space, but it's not necessarily the long-term solution for all the situations in the Torres Straits. We've deployed quite a range of different technologies and ways to try and track shifts in the coastal area, including some of the really cool stuff you can do now with very accurate drone-based mapping. But now there's really great satellite information that gives you just almost as good as information without all of that effort. So beyond the sea level rise impacts, the cays are challenging because storms actually rejuvenate the cays. And when we start putting hard infrastructure around the edges, we potentially reduce the ability of those cays to grow naturally. When big storms would naturally dump coral sands onto the islands, allowing them to grow. And there's also, because of the shifts in currents as well, there's this kind of delicate balance with the cays, which means that they're actually potentially moving directionally. And when that happens, you have this risk of sand being lost out of the cay system. It can migrate off the cay into deeper water. And when that happens, it can often get lost from the cay dynamic. So there's a mixture of influences going on with climate change beyond just the increase in the height of the water, its increase in wave intensity, its shifts in currents. All of these things add up to provide a kind of complex story around what's happening with the cays. And on top of that, they rely on a freshwater lens that sits under the sand. And that's what the vegetation and the communities tend to rely on. And there is a risk with sea level rise that saltwater lens gets increasingly inundated with saline water, the seawater, and that may be the most vulnerable part of these caves to sea level rise, because if those freshwater lenses become too polluted with saline water, essentially that all of the vegetation on that community would die and the island itself would essentially become probably quite uninhabitable. So as you can see, not a simple issue. And people obviously very sensitive to this discussion about what are they going to do under the future of climate change, because their culture is so strongly linked to their islands. And so moving people is possible, but it comes again at a huge cost. And it's the last option that people want to entertain. But most of this work now is being driven through the local councils who are implementing a lot of this work. Just Ray drove a lot of it initially. But as you can imagine, these conversations are quite delicate because you're talking about generations of people that have lived in these places. They're elders, they're they have their graves and burial sites from their ancestors on the islands, their cultural sites on the islands. So the thought of actually getting up and leaving is quite traumatic for many of them. Now, there is a precedent around this. Back in the 40s, there was a big storm event up on Saibai, and a bunch of people from that part of the world were actually relocated to Bamaga. And so it wouldn't be the first time that people would have to move because of a big marine storm event. But it's obviously it's the big concern for a lot of people in the Torres Straits is what's the long-term future of the region if we see increased sea level rises on these very small isolated islands out in the strait. You can imagine that it's a source of a tremendous amount of anxiety for people. Beyond all of those things, we've also done a huge amount of work really trying to understand community resilience, and communities up there operate in a very challenging space because it really is a interface of Western and cultural governance, value systems, and it makes it very challenging for a lot of people to get things going because they're trying to navigate action on a number of fronts at any one time. And we add to that things like the impacts of welfare and learned dependencies and a bunch of other forces that have come in, corroded culture, impacted people's capacity to be fully empowered in their own decision making and so on. So we've done quite a lot of work on really trying to figure out how do we build resilience in a place like the Torres Straits? What are the critical forces around that space, and how do we get people out of this? There's almost a kind of a dependency trap that communities are in, essentially. It's like, how do we break out of that dynamic so that they can really move forward into this changing future in a way that keeps their culture strong, in a way that keeps them connected to their communities, because the future is uncertain and it can really go downhill if there isn't a decent unified effort in terms of how the region meets this challenge. If people do meet this challenge in that kind of strategic, coordinated way, then the regions, despite the impacts of climates, can still have a strong future. But if they don't, there is a risk that many people will leave and the region will become a lot poorer as a result for it in terms of the culture that remains in the Torres Straits. So in terms of barriers to how the region responds to this, well, climate is obviously the big challenge, is one of the big challenges. It's just the rate of change we're seeing compared to the background. And people up there have definitely seen massive shifts in the seasons, in the behavior of plants and animals, in changes in their coastline. It's very real for them. It's not an academic exercise. The systems up there tend to be, from a governance point of view, like many other parts of the world, not particularly flexible, not necessarily particularly well adapted to the situation we're in, which does require the ability to be innovative, does require the ability to be flexible, less risk averse, all the kinds of things that governments typically aren't. So the governance structures up there are one of the areas that we're trying to bring more focus to bring in more climate resilience governance to allow the region to be able to be more dynamic and innovative as it moves forward. The region has a very limited economic base. Most of the money comes in through government agencies, and the fisheries are probably the main economic bases up there. So that in itself is a big constraint because it's, the more resources of communities have, the better able to adapt they are. So that certainly does place constraints on them. And we've already touched on sort of the high dependency on external resources. But at the same time, the people of the Torres Straits are very resourceful. Their culture is still very strong, despite the impacts that it has seen over the last couple of 100 years. And they still have an amazingly rich, diverse natural environment that they live in. So it's not all doom and gloom. And whilst the region is going to change, it's possible that the region can still have a bright future, but it is going to rely on that ability to really step into the space of resilience and truly being adaptive, truly being resourceful, and seeing this crisis that's in front of them, looking for the opportunities. There is always opportunities in a crisis. And it's a case of saying, okay, well, how do we use this moment to become a more unified region? How do we embrace some of the new ideas that are going to help the region move forward, some of the new technologies, some of the new governance systems, whilst maintaining those important aspects of their culture and their traditional values around community and connection to country, so that they can step forward into this future intact culturally, but adaptive. And that is, I think, the heart of the challenge for the region as it goes forward. Fortunately for the region, it is very important from a geopolitical standpoint. So I think that will always be a big plus because the Australian government is going to continue to invest in the Torres Straits because of where it is located. But despite that, it's still got obviously enormous challenges ahead. And that was, I hope I didn't speak too quickly, but that's my very high-level overview of climate change in the Torres Strait. So very happy to take questions and dive into some of those spaces in a little bit more depth, if you'd like to.
Thanks, John, for that fantastic talk. It's amazing hearing about what's going on Torres Strait. Let me please start with the question because so Torres Strait communities have been there for thousands of years probably now. Are you aware of any traditional oral stories that identify this type of environmental changes, like as drastic and as rapid as the ones that we are currently observing?
It's a great question, Xavier. There are, I wouldn't say lots, but there's definitely stories of people having to move because of things like water. The islands are not necessarily, many of the islands don't have a lot of natural water supply. And traditionally, some of them were inhabited, got to the point where the water supply was exhausted and communities had to move. So moving because of constraints is not necessarily new. But as you said, the background rate of change of things like sea level has been pretty slow for a long time, even though it's been quite dramatic in a geological term. In terms of human lifetimes and so on, it's been a relatively slow process. And the region hasn't had this. I mean, mainland Australia has indigenous habitation going back, I'm not sure, I think they're up to 75,000 years or somewhere around that kind of park. I don't think the Torres Straits' history goes back that far, but it's more likely to be in that kind of 4,000 year ballpark as far as I've been able to ascertain. But generally speaking, I think most of the people up there have been part of a pretty stable environment for a long time. So this kind of change we're seeing, there would have been a lot of change with Western arrival into the region. And now on top of it, they're starting to see a lot more shifts in their ecology and the weather systems as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Because if not, I have a few others. So I'll just keep going then. Oh, sorry. There we go. So there's a question from Ross. Are most of the population inhabiting coral cays or islands? And is this a significant factor in the different by impacts?
No, most of so the coral cays, there's really Parma, Musig, and Yama is not a coral cay, but it's considered as part of the cay group. And Warraba, they're really the only islands that actually have populations on them. So the total number of people on cays is only probably about 1,000 or so people in the region. Most people are living on Thursday Island has the biggest population, and that's just a classic continental island. But obviously, people are concerned about all the people in the Torres Straits, regardless of which islands they're on. The coral, the cays are most exposed, along with the Orkney and Saibai, which are very low-lying mud-based islands.
Thank you. We have another question from Helen. Are there any of the island communities in particular that are more active in adaptation action? And how does the Torres Strait Regional Authority typically work with the local council and elders in this area?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Yeah, there are. I would say that's there's an amazing array of diversity between communities in the region as well. So there's a number of different language groups. There's five clusters of communities in the region. And so there is variation around how people respond to things. We've worked a lot with Musig, and we've always found Musig to be a very progressive little community that are very willing to embrace new ideas. So we've done a lot of work with them around introducing new technologies and various sustainability initiatives. Because like in my role, it was just impossible to work with all the communities at the same time. So I had to pick a couple of communities to really focus in on. I worked mostly with Musik and with Murray Island or Mur, which is the home of native tidal, and it's a beautiful volcanic island in the eastern Torres Straits. But quite a different community, and so it's not uniform, but certainly there are some community. Badu is very progressive economically as a community. They all have their kind of strengths that they play to in terms of how they're responding to things and their culture and their language. So not even we work mostly with the local governments in terms of how we can support each other in supporting the community. So TSRA has done a lot of the initial work around building the science because we had massive data gaps in our knowledge around what was happening in the Straits. We didn't have any sea surface temperature data. There were two weather stations. One was not very accurate before. We've introduced more weather stations. A lot of different monitoring has been brought into the region just so that we can get some real data on what's happening. A lot of work's been done on the coastal areas, as you well know, because you were part of that work, Javier, from the early days. So we work collaboratively with those organizations as much as we can, and we've been fortunate because I think one of the assets the region has is TSRA as a government agency has been able to bring in a lot of investment as well. So we've been able to support a lot of that research and environmental work to try and get a better grip on how climate is actually impacting communities in the region.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? So I'll ask you one more because I was in Torres Strait. I did my PhD in Torres Strait many years ago, or more 20 years ago. And I recently went back. So last year, later in the year, last year, I was there. And even though many of these islands change quite significantly, especially the low ones, the K islands, it seems that they also have a core that is quite stable. So, and doesn't move much. So I'm wondering if seawalls are the only solution when talking about sea level rise and erosion, given that once you start armoring the coastline, then basically you are fixing that coastline and yeah, and not letting those islands adapt as they would naturally do.
Yeah, it's a really important question, Javier, and it's for me personally, I found this one of the really challenging areas because I would agree with you. I don't think seawalls are always the best strategy because they can potentially, particularly in the case of the cays, they have the potential to inhibit the ability of the cay to actually respond to sea level rise if not done properly. So, but again, it's, normally your options are depending on what's happening with sea level, but you can either try and defend the coast, you can either move away from the coast, or you can adapt by raising your houses and stuff off the ground so that they're less vulnerable to the impacts. And so it may be a case of all of those things have to be brought to bear depending on the circumstance. But given what we know about sea level rise, it's likely that the coastal defenses are really going to buy time, but they're not a long-term solution. And that's part of the challenge, because like most people, and it's perfectly normal, people want to have this sense of, hang on, I want something real that's actually going to protect us from this shift. And it's a challenging conversation because I get a lot of the rangers and other wonderful folks up there that are keeping an eye on this stuff coming in saying, hey, we're seeing all these changes, we're seeing all these changes. And at one level, it's like, yep, that's what's going to happen. Like, we can't stop the sea from doing what the sea is going to do. So we have to think long term. We have to think more strategically. And it's not just about if communities have to move, it's also about the communities that have to receive them. So this is where, for me, I would like to see that longer term planning happening to try and get a real sense of, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Because I think that would be helpful for people to at least know, look, everyone's going to do what they can to keep people on their communities. But if we can't, then plans are already in place that they're not just going to be suddenly impacted by a massive event and then left to figure it out for themselves. And this is the way these things tend to go, right? It's not just that we see this gradual change in sea level rise over time, but what happens is you get these major events come along every now and then, and they really can smash into a community. And that's usually what drives the change, where people go, I know there's communities in the Pacific that have left because of these huge impacts, and they've moved to, they're just like, we don't feel safe here anymore, and they've left. So it's those big events that actually drive the change, but it's a long, complicated conversation, and the communities really have to be on board to understand, what does this mean, and what are the trigger points where we start to go, okay, we're starting to see signs of this. Now what's our next step in this longer term strategy? So it's a big question. It's a really important question, and there's no simple answer, but I do agree that fundamentally seawalls are not the be all and end all to climate change problems in the Torres Straits.
Thanks, John. We have 3 more questions. So let's start with the first one from Sean. How does the geomorphology vary between the island communities, if at all? And how does this affect expected impacts from climate change? For example, are all islands formed from sedimentary silts, or are there also volcanic rock formations which are more stable in the face of extreme weather events?
Yeah, so there are the 4 main island types up there. There's the cays, there's the volcanic islands in the east, there's the continental islands, and then there's basically those kind of pluvial islands which are formed from the muds coming out of the rivers in Papua New Guinea. So 4 very different types of geomorphology, and the continental islands tend to be probably least at risk, and the volcanic islands, they've got elevation. Communities have space to move away from the coast. They've got space to move up to higher ground. The flat islands, which are basically the mud islands, communities are far more restricted in their capacity to respond. So they don't have often many options to escape. And all of those islands respond differently to the impacts of like I said, it's sea level rise, it's obviously wave dynamics, it's saline intrusion, it's the height of the water. There's a bunch of drivers going on. And of course, the other really important part of the case is the fact that the coral reefs themselves are suffering. And so they're not so healthy anymore. And so you need healthy reefs to keep healthy cays going long term. So you might see an influx of material as reefs die, but then that's going to taper off, and then it's not, then maybe there's not so much new material coming in. So it's a very dynamic system, particularly for the caves.
Thanks. Maria is asking if people from Masik or the other islands use the surrounding uninhabited islands for resources.
Yes, they do. So a lot of the communities make very good use of surrounding islands. There's a lot of work going on to set up indigenous protected areas across some of those islands, so communities have some additional resourcing to monitor the environments on those islands and make sure they're being protected and looked after, because there are other people who move through the region who can impact the region in that way. So basically, yes, people up there do use plant, animal, and other resources from islands around where they inhabit as well.
Thanks. Going back to seawalls, Helen is asking if is there any of the seawalls already not fit for purpose, given sea level rise that has already happened? And if so, what ideas do the communities have for alternatives?
Well, when the Saibai seawall was constructed, one of the things that we're trying to impress upon people is to say, look, the seawall is not necessarily going to stop all the water getting into your island, because there's a big wetland behind the community, and that kind of pumps up with water with the rains and so on. So there's a bund behind, a seawall in the front. But if you have a massive rainfall event, you've basically created a swimming pool. And so you've still got to be able to let that water out of the system. So there are valves in the wall designed to allow water to escape as well. But again, you're balancing this situation with water coming in from the skies, water coming in from the seas. And the walls are really designed to they're designed to do a couple of things. One is to stabilize the coast, and the other is to take the energy out of the wave. So if you have a big storm event and you've got communities that are living literally right on the coast, you don't want those big waves to smash into people's homes. So the walls really don't necessarily stop all the water, because it's called overtopping, as I'm sure you know, but basically the waves will crash over the wall, but most of the energy is taken out of the system. So people will still end up with some water in the community after a big storm on a king tide. So it's about also building that awareness that this is what the walls actually do. They're not going to keep everything perfectly dry, but they are going to massively reduce the capacity of these events to damage your community.
Thanks. Keegan is asking if in the current school curriculum, there is very minimal focus on the region. So how would you recommend approaching this type of topic with young people to build greater awareness?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's true. The Torres Straits is not very well understood or known in many parts of Australia. Now, prior to this, I was telling Javier about a friend of mine who he knows well, who was at a geographers conference, and they were all asked to go and stand on the part of Australia where they worked. And at the geographers conference, the Torres Straits wasn't even on the map. So it is such an interesting region because it is so important from culturally and ecologically. It's a really significant part of the world. And yet it's not very well known within Australia. I was even trying to send some materials from Brisbane up there a few years ago, and the lady in the Brisbane office said, sorry, we don't ship overseas. It's like, well, it's actually a Queensland postcode. So, yeah, I think it's just one of those things where I don't know if it's necessarily going to be increased exposure in the school curriculum, but it's a region that tends to punch above its weight in a lot of ways. The whole native title concept and a driver came from the Torres Straits. And so the people up there are very they're pretty progressive, really like most people around the world. They're really lovely. They're smart, they're capable people, but they are in this very challenging space. And I think the more people appreciate what we have to lose when regions like the Torres Strait get impacted, it's not just a loss for them, it's a loss for all Australians, it's a loss for the world, because the assets up there ecologically and culturally are of global significance. And so we should all be doing our utmost to make sure that, they have a fighting chance under this very challenging future that we're all facing.
Thank you. Ross has a technical question. Is there any drone mapping or GIS data layers freely publicly available of the Torres Strait relating to climate change and its impacts?
Yeah, it's we basically make all of our data available so if you wanted data on that sort of stuff, you just contact the TSRA. We're generally more than happy to make that kind of, we're a government agency, so we've got there's been a lot of work trying to get datum information straight in the Torres Straits. One of the challenges when I started up there was the datum values were all out. So for people that are not familiar with the datum values, basically your mean sea level value that everything is mapped against. If you're an engineer, you want to know what that value is so that when you're building, you know where you are in terms of what's happening with the sea. Those values were out on Boiga, they were over 1 meter out. So massively out. So there's been a huge effort to try and get much better datums that all of the mapping can actually be much more accurate, because if you're building, if you're investing $24 million in seawalls and stuff like that, you want to know you're actually working on the right datum values. Some of the work I saw in the early days on seawalls, the seawall stuff was just way out because they were using the wrong datums. So back to the technical question, yes, if you're after specific information, you're more than welcome to inquire at the TSRA and we can see how we can help you out.
Thank you. Are there any last questions from the floor? So I have one final question, because I really like how you ended your presentation saying that where there's a crisis, there's opportunity. And certainly the Torres Strait communities have a long legacy of leadership. And I'm wondering if this type of, because they are in the middle of this crisis, and is there any opportunity for them to lead this space across the world? Because there's many other places experiencing very similar conditions. I just came back from both Vanuatu and PNG, and you could just replace your talk with Vanuatu and PNG, and it's exactly the same. So I'm wondering if there is any conversation that goes beyond our boundaries, and is there any talk across communities globally to look into future solutions for these issues?
A great question, Javier. Yeah, look, there is probably not as much collaboration as possible. Certainly, there's been some, visits to some of the Pacific communities, but Torres Straits folks, to see what they're doing there. There is a common challenge for these island communities around the world. I think there's a huge opportunity for the Torres Straits to lead in this space, because not many remote indigenous communities have access to the kind of resourcing that the Torres Straits does. The Lovers or Haters, the Torres Strait Regional Authority, is a government, a Commonwealth entity in the region. It's specific to the Torres Straits. And because of that, we've been able to get a lot of this work going, because we can tap into some funding, and that really makes a massive difference. So hopefully we can continue to build on that work and make those. So on the resilience stuff, for example, there's been a lot of work we've tried to do to try and map out community planning processes and ways for people to assess where they sit on the resilience spectrum, in order that they can then put their energy into building more resilient communities. And it's a very deep dive into what resilience means. It's, beyond, it's resilience is a beautifully practical term, but it's also got a lot of conceptual underpinnings that you want to make sure that you're really building good resilience, proper resilience in the region. And so we've kind of taken a deep dive into that space. But if we can get those wheels moving and then use that model and say to other communities, look, here's a model, use it for your part of the world, because it's it's not just the challenge with this issue we've got is it's so multifaceted. And you can have an island that's going to get hit by a storm, but it might also be hit by a heat wave, and it might also be hit by a lack of supplies coming in from somewhere else. And it might also be, you can get concurrent impacts in one space at a time. And that's when resilience really kicks into play around how the communities are able to weather those changes and recover from them. And you don't want to be too reliant on outside forces, and you don't want to be too independent. There's a balance in how you build optimal resilience for these kinds of communities. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that they can all learn from each other, and they really should be learning from each other. And there are various initiatives around trying to build a better understanding of island communities respond to climate change. But certainly, yeah, we can certainly do better in that space as well.
Thank you, John. And I'm aware of time, but we do have a last question. So thank you, John. Great presentation. As a researcher in climate change adaptation, focusing on Tuvalu, I found this really relevant and interesting, especially a discussion around seawalls. I was curious if the Torres Strait has implemented any nature-based solutions like mangrove planting or coral reef restoration, and if so, do they work?
Okay, another really great question. Certainly scope for us to test some of that stuff. The challenge with mangroves in our part of the world is it's not a challenge, but we haven't lost many mangroves. In other parts of the world, like Vietnam, a lot of mangrove communities have been cleared for aquaculture and so on. And in those circumstances, you can recover mangrove communities. In the Torres Straits, there really hasn't been that kind of impact. So if you try and plant mangroves somewhere in the Torres Straits, they're probably not going to grow, because if they're not growing there naturally now, there's a reason why they're not growing, and you can plant some, but they're probably not going to make it, right? Because you're really trying to plant mangroves in an environment which is not suitable for them. So mangrove restoration is of limited value in the Torres Straits. There is scope to look at some reef restoration work for sure. And that's still an unexplored space for the region, but certainly one that I think they should consider.
Thank you very much, John, for that. That was, again, a great presentation, and I'm sure everyone agrees with that. So, being aware of time, and if there's no other questions, I think we can now wrap it up.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity, and I hope you leave with a little bit more understanding about this particularly special part of the world.
Brilliant.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. We'll wrap it there, and we'll see you again at another event very soon.
Thanks. Bye.